Yeah, hello everyone. Um, Thanks for inviting me to Svienna. I I hoped I could make it in person, but sadly it didn't work out this time. But um, that doesn't mean that it will never happen. I mean, I'm basically just around the corner in Germany, so I'll definitely make that happen sometime, and then we can see each other in person. Yeah. So for this time, I'm going to talk about Svelte 5 and why did we do that, or to put it in more dramatical, um, put on a more dramatical picture. Spell five. Why the hell did you do that? That may be the reaction some of you may have had when first seeing the new syntax. And in this talk, I want to go a bit over what is the reasoning behind these changes, and to hopefully shed some light on the thinking and decision behind this. So when Svelte 3 came out in 2019, it took the front-end world by storm. Rich Harris gave a great talk rethinking reactivity about it and showcased a compiler-centric approach that can lead to simpler and more efficient code. I remember how fascinated I was about just needing to write let statements and they were magically reactive. But over the years, cracks have appeared in Svelte, so to speak, especially with larger and more complex applications that were highly interactive. It became difficult to keep track of the reactivity model, or inconsistencies in the reactivity model showed up. And generally, the front-end world has evolved significantly since then. Like 5 years of that's almost an eternity in the JavaScript ecosystem. To put that into perspective, 2019, that was still at my previous job when I wasn't working at Vercel yet. Many developers, including me, had to still support Internet Explorer 11. That's the time back then. So a lot has changed. Browsers became more capable of doing things, but expectations have also risen. But Svelte itself hasn't really changed much in that time. And so now, 5 years later, with three of us working on the front end framework full time, a big thriving community with great meetups like yours, it was time to fundamentally review Svelte and consider what is really core to it, what do we need to keep the spirit alive, and which things can we improve upon. Or to put it in the words of Rich Harrow's talk title, rethinking reactivity. And the result of these considerations is Svelte 5. And now let's take a closer look at those and the decisions that came up to those. So first up, rules. Why did you do that? The dollar sign, or beloved dollar sign. Svelte had the idea to repurpose the completely unused but valid syntax of labeled statements to create a new kind of reactivity. And this was a great idea and a big part of why Svelte felt so concise and elegant. But over time, it became clear that it's not without its flaws and limitations, and so let's explore some. Can you spot the bug here? We're reading double eagerly on the first render in line 4, but it's not defined by then yet. This will print undefined. The double will first be evaluated right before the template runs. And this can also mean that you're reading stale values when you're in the middle of an update. So for example, in line 9, you will, after you have incremented the count will be the new value, but double will still be the old one. This is something you have to be aware of when using this. Here's another bug. Let's assume you have an actually very complex computation, not just count times 2, and you move that into a function because you may want to reuse it or it makes the code more readable. But now the reactive statement in this case, it just doesn't rerun anymore when count changes because it doesn't know that it depends on count. You have to manually tell the compiler about that dependency because the compiler only looks at the reactive statement itself and doesn't follow functions or imports or something. So what many of us did in that case is to then pass in function arguments that the function doesn't really need, or any other kind of workarounds. So in a sense, you end up in a situation a bit like with use effect in React, where you have to pass in an array of dependencies. And then there's the expectation problem. Svelte in the tutorial teaches you reactive statements as being rerun when their dependencies change, a bit of like an Excel cell. But that's not actually true, because they only rerun once per tick. So in this example, you don't end up with the count being 10, you end up with the count being 2. Because of this, Svelte also does static analysis to automatically order reactive statements in the most optimal order, so that they run once but in the right order. And since dependencies could be hidden, as we've just seen, the order could be wrong. And this happened to many people. They were starting with a few reactive statements, added a few more, refactored a bit, and suddenly the chain of reactive statements broke. Something didn't update anymore, or something suddenly ran before something else. And it was very hard to understand why that happened. All these gotchas are not obvious when you start your journey into Svelte. It feels very simple, but really it's not when you look closer. People have built very elaborate, complex applications with Svelte, and then they work fine. Until then, they run into one of those issues. At that point, it's probably already too late. They've coded themselves into a corner, basically, and then have to refactor a lot of code. There are several issues on the GitHub tracker where this exact thing has happened to people. There's also the whole refactoring story and the two worlds problem. As long as you're at the top level of components, you can use all the Svelte niceties and shorthands, let, $, and so on. But as soon as you start to refactor your code into functions, you're out of luck. You have to switch to the more verbose API of stores, which is a mostly cumbersome and tedious refactoring process, and then you end up with code that is a lot less declarative and nice to read than before. I mean, in this example, it's still a lot very readable, but imagine this was a more involved example than just a simple counter. Because this refactoring was a big undertaking every time you had to do it, the incentive to refactor code out into reusable functions or to share code, this incentive was a lot lower. And so people ended up with more stuff in their components than what should probably be in those components. And that hurts maintainability over time. And then there's more reasons besides that. For example, it doesn't play nice with TypeScript. Our tooling needs to jump through some hoops to make the script's contents actually type checkable. If you declare $double equals count times 2, that doesn't actually mean that double is now a declared variable. You have to hack around that and tell TypeScript behind the scenes that this is actually what we mean. It also needs additional API you have to learn to work around some shortcomings. For example, the export let to declare a property that only works with one identifier at the time. So if you have a component that says, I also expect any other properties you give to me, you need to use $rest props or $props for that, which is API, which we had to invent because there's no other way. And if you want to rename a prop, for example, you want to expose a class property, you have to use this very involved export as syntax, and you soon don't know really what you're doing there anymore. So these reasons is why we ultimately decided to switch away from the $, export let, etc., to more explicit API rules. It's a bit more code to write in simple cases, but we also believe it's easier to read. And I mean, that's what Svelte is optimizing for in a lot of cases. Reading code is much more common than writing it. And if you're a newcomer to Svelte or a newcomer coming to a Svelte project, you have a much better time understanding what's going on there by reading keywords like state, derived, effect, compared to just $, or let statements. Also, all the other things are handled by these changes. So TypeScript, for example, does understand this much better, because to TypeScript you can just tell that $props, etc. These are global functions. So there's less hackery involved. We not only switched the API, we also switched how it's interpreted. So the reactivity is no longer based purely on the compiler. The dependency graph is created at runtime. Under the hood, we're using signals for this, and the result is more predictable and less error-prone. Reactivity that also works better in edge cases. I think there's like 30 issues or something on the GitHub tracker, which are just fixed by changing the reactivity model to a more runtime-based approach. And it also fixes all the shortcomings I've shown earlier. Now, if you console log double, you will always get the latest value, no matter where you are. When you write derivations, the runtime will automatically figure out which thing to call first, in which order. There's no more reordering necessary, so to speak. So there can be no possibility of something missing. Also, derivations and effects rerun whenever their dependencies changes. So you cannot end up in a situation where something runs less often than you would have thought it does. And the thing is also, what this opens up is an entire new world for us, because reactivity is now more explicit. We were able to make it universal. So you can now use the same reactive primitives inside and outside of the top level of components. This wasn't possible before, as I've shown with the store refactorings. And that was a pain point for many people, because they like to stay in Svelte land. Now you can do that. All you have to do to make this little counter reusable is to extract it into a function. The highlighted code stays exactly the same. You just need to wrap around it a function, and then you need to return the things that should stay reactive using getters, so that the reactivity is preserved. These getters, this is nothing related to Svelte. This is how JavaScript itself works, and how you can also make in regular JavaScript keep things alive across boundaries, so to speak. In that sense, runes are just a tiny wrapper that gives the compiler hints which things are then actually reactive to which the Svelte runtime needs to react. We tried this approach with more implicit syntax, like reusing $: or let. And we implemented some of these approaches, and they all ended up being very hard to reason about. You would end up with infinite loops all over the place. You had no idea how to actually reason about your code, which things were reactive, which things weren't. And if we had to keep the $: syntax, we also wouldn't be able to move this code from Svelte files into svelte.ts or svelte.js files, where these runes can live now too. Because in these files, the TypeScript IntelliSense is the one telling your editor what is valid. And we can't just make $: statements that happen there. So we tried to keep, we explored how it would feel to keep the old API, but it just wasn't working. And so we traded a bit more code to write for a more explicit, easier to reason about API. Okay, that's it for runes. Next up, event attributes. Why did you do that? So in Svelte 4 and 3, you mainly did events using the on: syntax. On the surface, this looks nice because the colon is a clear indicator that this is an event listener. It also feels kind of correct that events are special, and so they deserve their own syntax. But on a closer look, these design decisions worked against Svelte's simplicity. You had to import create event dispatcher as a function, as an import from Svelte. Then you had to call that function, from which you get a dispatch variable. And then you had to call that again with a string of the event name. And these events were, you could pass payloads to them, but the payload was on a detail property on the object, because what actually was dispatched here was custom events. So it was all a bit boilerplatey and more code than you need to write. And when you were looking for what events a component emits, you had to scan the whole file to find the create event dispatcher calls to see, okay, what events does this actually dispatch? Alternatively, if you use TypeScript, you had to type the generic of the create event dispatcher function, but that meant you had to type even more. And when using the component, even if you were using TypeScript, you still wouldn't have perfect type safety, because the nature of create event dispatcher is very dynamic. You don't need to invoke it only. You can invoke it anywhere as long as it's during component initialization. So any import could potentially hide the create event dispatcher invocation. And so for IntelliSense, it was never certain to know, okay, there are no other events besides the ones in Svelte file. So if you mistyped an event name, you wouldn't get a red squiggly in your editor. You also wouldn't get a runtime error because of the way Svelte subscribed to these events. You would just get a silent failure, and that's not good. It also meant that there's two ways to doing component events, because you could also use properties to define these events, like callback props. But since that wasn't as idiomatic, and because you were already using on: as syntax to listening to DOM events, no one really was doing that. It didn't feel encouraged to do that. Another thing is, you couldn't just forward events. If you wanted to forward an event from a child component to a parent component, you had to manually forward each event one by one. So if you wanted to forward multiple events, that meant on click, on hover, on double click, on key down, whatever. Many things you needed to write out. And if you're using a third-party component library which didn't forward the event you're interested in, then you're out of luck. Some component libraries worked around this, either by inventing their own syntax for passing arbitrary event objects, which meant even more inconsistency in the ecosystem, or they hacked into Svelte internals, which is no good because internals are not like under subject to the Sender, because it's the internal runtime, so it can change at any time. There were even some libraries who, for this reason, they would have liked to support Svelte also, but they just couldn't because there was no way to really forward all events. And so all these outcomes were not ideal and against like Svelte's simplicity. So this is why we implemented event attributes in Svelte 5. Instead of having a special syntax for events, we treat them as attributes. So in other words, the colon disappears. Instead of on: click, you write just on click. And that means, because events are just attributes now, we can get rid of create event dispatcher, because we can now just treat events as components, as callback props. And that removes a lot of boilerplate and also makes it easier to reason about the component, because you look at the $props rune and see, okay, these are the things, the properties and event this component has. And because events are just attributes, we can also spread them now, meaning the limitation of having to forward each event separately is gone. And generally, the flexibility of this approach is much higher. And once you used it for a bit, you'll notice that the syntactical separation between events and attributes starts to feel a bit arbitrary, or rather, you're not really missing the colon, really. I mean, in JavaScript, if you want to get notified of something, you pass a callback into a function. It's the same principle, and you don't have any special syntax there either, so why should you in Svelte? This also means you have to learn less concepts when getting started with Svelte, so it gets easier going with it. And so that's why we did event attributes. And lastly, this is the last time you have to see my face making silly YouTube thumbnail reactions. Lastly, we look at snippets, which unlock both new possibilities of composition and reuse, but also serve as a replacement of slots. So we're going to discuss now why that is. To recap, slots allow you to define a placeholder in your component that can be filled with arbitrary content by the parent component. In this example, we have a button component, and we can fill the button with any UI from the parent, any text we want. Now the question is, what's wrong with this API? Why does it need changing? And to be frank, in this example, nothing's wrong with it. It's simple, it works. But as we've seen with the other APIs by now, it doesn't stay simple, and so the problems start to arise. The main problem comes from the fact that we can pass data from the child component back up to the parent component. That's a powerful feature which, for example, allows us to create generic lists where we can pass in a slot that then is rendered for each item, as in this example. We have a list, we pass it some items, and then we use these let directives to get back the property. And it's these let directives that are really confusing to reason about. When I first learned Svelte, this was giving me the most headache. And it took me a while to understand that let:item creates a variable. And if you rename a variable, you can do that, but that's even more confusing because then you write equals, braces open, to do, braces close. And so that means you can use the to do variable, which is the item slot prop. But that's like really backwards because in all other directives, that means you pass a reference of to do into some directive. And this time it's like completely the other way around, that this defines a variable. So it's really confusing. And there's also the scope reasoning problem, because if you look at the code, it looks like the variable of the default slot is usable within the empty slot. But of course it isn't, because the item slot prop is used for each item in the array. And if there are no items, then I show the empty slot. So it cannot be that this is available in there. But it looks like it. Also, is the variable that item, is that thing available on the component itself or just on the sub children? It's not clear at all what's going on there. Also, when you have named slots, you may have to add the slot. You have to add the slot attribute to the elements to say, okay, this element goes into this named slot. But maybe sometimes you don't want to have one single element that goes into a slot, or as in this example, you don't want to pass any element into the slot. You just want to pass text. So we had to invent this Svelte fragment special element to work around this. So that meant more API surface area. And there's even more API surface area with $slots, which that tells you is the slot set or not. So it's more and more API around shortcomings of the initial API. And snippets solve all these problems by being much clearer to reason about. You define a snippet within a component boundary, which means it's passed as a property to that component. You could also write it outside and then actually pass it as a property, but this is like syntax sugar. Each snippet defines its own scope, and it's very clearly visible because there's the hash snippet opening and then the slash snippet closing. And you know, okay, in there, the things that are passed to the snippet are defined, and only in there. Snippets, in a sense, they look a bit like functions, and that's also how you can think about them. They're just variables that you can pass around, and when invoked, in other words, rendered, they show up somewhere. And because snippets are just variables, they are also, again, just properties. And together with event attributes, which means components, properties can also be events, that unlocks a powerful end state, that the public API of components is now entirely defined by its properties. So there's no more scanning the component for slots, create event dispatcher invocations. You just look at the $props rune and look what's in there to know what this component is capable of. Yes, in the simplest case, this may be a bit more to write, but it'll save you on readability and reasoning big time. It also makes them more powerful because snippets are just variables, so you can pass them around via context. You could even save them into some global state and then render them somewhere completely else. The possibilities are endless. So to summarize, snippets are both more clear to way to define UI placeholders, and they are also an entire new way to compose or transport UI elements somewhere. All the while, you have less concepts to learn at the same time, having more power. And so that's why we did replace slots with snippets. If there's one thing that hopefully became clear from this talk, it's that Svelte 5 is now simpler than ever. The simplicity and syntax was magical in Svelte 3, but you had to keep a lot of implicit knowledge in your head and read between the lines to not fall into one of the various gotchas and traps. Svelte 5 avoids that with one clear and consistent reactivity model and the overall more focused and explicit API. In case you didn't know, you can upgrade to Svelte 5 without having to rewrite all your code. The Svelte 4 free syntax, that still works in Svelte 5. So you can upgrade one component at a time if you want to. We even provide a migration script, which you can use to automatically convert a lot of the things to the new syntax. So I hope you're excited as we are about the future of Svelte. And if you were previously put off by the syntax changes as the faces in my thumbnails were, then you'll hopefully you will give it another try now. Or at least you can understand better why we made these changes. And with that, I say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I don't know if you hear us.
Yeah, I can.
So maybe just before the audience have a question, when is it released?
It's weeks rather than months. Let's put it that way.
Oh,
so
okay.
We're close. I'd say the biggest thing standing between us and the release is the documentation side and the tutorial. So we need to rewrite all that and update that to the latest syntax, so that on day one you get proper documentation and so on.
Nice. Okay, thank you. Some of you have some questions, maybe? Yes, no?
I have a question.
I don't know if you can hear from there. Let's see. Let's see, try.
Okay, if you can hear me, have you guys looked a little bit into how bundle size changed between Svelte 4 and Svelte 5? Does it increase or decrease?
Yeah, we did. The bundle size, the baseline is a bit higher because more things have shifted to the runtime. But so if you have a Hello World component, that's a bit bigger, but no one just writes a Hello World component. You do actual stuff with that. And so after a few components, it actually starts to get smaller, the bundle, because the component, the code that is outputted per component is much smaller compared to Svelte 4. So if you have a modest app, then you will see bundle size savings for sure.
Nice.
One question. When it comes to snippets, what was the inspiration? Is there something existing that you kind of took, or is it actually your invention?
We looked around and thought about what can we do there. Originally, we thought about how can we re-render certain snippets of UI within a component. So it didn't start out as a replacement for props. and as such, it was basically invented on our own, so to speak. So there was no like clear blueprint from anywhere else. And then we realized, hey, this at the same time is also a perfect replacement for slots, because it makes things easier to reason about in the more complex cases. So it actually, we found that we can kill two birds with one stone, so to speak.
Yeah, Amen.
So for how long will we still have the Svelte 4 syntax supported? Like, is it going to be gone in Svelte 6, or are there any plans?
So right now there's no plan as to when we will remove it. We may remove it at some point. I think that's clear. But we're not talking like a few months or something. We're talking more like years. So we will closely monitor how many people have upgraded to the Svelte 5 version, how many people have upgraded to the new syntax. We will monitor these things to then make a decision at which point we will remove the old syntax. But we will definitely give people enough time to migrate at their own speed.
So like going forward, it is recommended to use like snippets instead of slots, and basically all of the rooms instead of the old things, because eventually they will be gone.
So, sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
So going forward, do you recommend to use the rooms instead of slots and the old syntax, like just to be sure and not to have to rewrite things in the future?
Yeah, you're going forward. If you're on Svelte 5 and you're writing new components, it's recommended to use the runes API, to use snippets, to use event attributes instead of slots or the on directive or the old $: syntax. Yes, and that's also how we're gonna basically in the tutorial you will probably not even see the old syntax anymore. We're just going to teach the new concepts, the new syntax. And of course, we will have in the docs callouts like in Svelte 4, you would have done it this way, and we will have a dedicated Svelte 3.4 syntax page. But the recommended way forward is the new syntax.
Yes, so I have a question about classes. And regarding the slide where you explained the native JavaScript get set syntax,
Yes.
I was writing my code like how you wrote it initially, until I realized and I suspect if you refactor that into a class, it would say your line count would decrease. Because I think Rich explained that classes will automatically create getters and setters. So I've started writing classes a lot more than I'm used to, including like classes that just have like 2 members or something, or 1 member even. Is that going to be kind of common? Is that what you're expecting? Is that normal?
I think that class is going to be a lot more common. And you're right that I could have written that example using classes as well, refactoring that into classes. It just didn't like show that you can keep the exact same code you have and move it into function. That like I wanted to show that you don't have to change anything in the core at all. But yes, you're absolutely right that probably in a lot of cases it makes sense to refactor things to using classes, because I think we in the Svelte team think that classes have like a bad reputation. Some kind as a in some ways it is justified, because people like from the diehard object-oriented programming world, like with extends and deeply nested hierarchies, like that gets really confusing. But on its own, classes are really useful for encapsulating a piece of state or behavior and associate methods with it that change the state that they control. And so we think that's why we added support for classes the way we did, so that it's very ergonomic to use them in that way. And so yeah, it's totally totally correct that you're using classes. That's totally fine.
Perfect. Maybe a last question, yeah?
Yeah. Thanks for the great talk, Simon, and also thanks for the work you do. I have a question about after the release of Svelte 5, will you and the team at Vercel be working on SvelteKit, or will the team be different people?
We will be focusing more towards SvelteKit after the release, that's for sure. Like first we want to like see how's the reception, maybe tweak some documentation, maybe there's a bug that needs fixing, maybe we have a feature request that needs our attention. But I think that soon afterwards we will transition back over into SvelteKit to then see, okay, what use can we make of the new capabilities that we have? Because Svelte 5 is also laying the groundwork for a lot more things we have in mind with regards to how do you do data loading, how you compose your components and so on. And through the new runtime and the API, we have some ideas there, and those also are directly correlated to SvelteKit. And so we'll definitely focus on SvelteKit more.
Cool.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. And thank you. We'll let you go, I think, Simon, and then we'll continue also on our talk on our side. Don't know if we do a small break or you can proceed directly.
Just want to have 5 minutes break.
We'll just refill water here and more than just water, and then we continue in 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you very much, Simon.
All right. Bye. Have a nice evening.
And next time you can come here. Yes.
Yeah, I hope to make it.
Thank you.
Bye.